Welcome back, guys. I'm Dr. Chris Erskine, and this is U.S. History with Avanches Top Up. We're almost finished with this course. You are down to the last few chapters. Hang in there. We're almost done. Today we're going to talk about the 1970s, the stalemated 70s. Now that word stalemate means nothing much is changing. So let's start talking about Nixon, because when we left the last chapter, Johnson was president, ended the war in Vietnam, and Nixon wins by a landslide. Or we're going to see, he doesn't win by a landslide in 1968, but he's about to in 1972. So Nixon, we think about Nixon's domestic policy. Now for the next couple of presidents, what we're going to do is talk about domestic, meaning their policies in the United States, and international, their policies that have to do with other countries. And so we're going to talk about domestic and international policy with the next 4 or 5 presidents. So with Nixon, domestic policy means policy inside the United States. Now, he believed, now remember, he's coming at the end of the civil rights movement. Nixon believes that schools should not necessarily be integrated. He doesn't fight against it. Supreme Court and Congress has already passed laws, but he doesn't have to help. And he says that schools are for education, not for integration. It's not for social movement. It's for just to go to school to learn. You shouldn't focus on anything else. That's what Nixon believed. That so white kids maybe only with white kids, and black kids only with black kids, and Chinese kids only with Chinese kids, and Latinos only with Latinos. That would be an extreme view of what Richard Nixon might have said. Under his presidency, the 26th Amendment is passed, which means that the 26th change to the Constitution, and this lowers the voting age to 18, and that's in 1971. He tried to make sure that he could get the Southern white vote, and he tried to delay segregation and integration in Mississippi. And under Nixon, there were abuses by the CIA and the FBI and the NSA, National Security Agency. And all kinds of really difficult things happened during Nixon's presidency. So on the next slide, we can see some things that happened, and then we're going to kind of jump into some of his international policy. The United States invades Cambodia in 1970. Nixon doesn't tell the American people, but he just does it. So we're at war and we don't know it. And in May, the Kent State killings, 4 people are killed, and we'll see a picture of that in the next slide. In 1971, the U.S. invades Laos, and though we forgot there in 1970, there's also Jackson State killings on May 15. And so these are protests against what the United States government is doing, and the National Guard or the Army comes in and shoots people. And so not a good thing. And so in this next slide, we see a picture of someone laying on the ground, very famous picture in the United States. And this is at Kent State University, which is in Ohio. And 4 people were killed in this shooting. It's not really a massacre, although we call it that in English. A massacre is where hundreds of people are killed. And here only 4. It's a big deal. It's a big deal in American culture, and it shows for the first time that the American government is willing to kill Americans on U.S. soil. And so Americans are very upset by the Kent State and the Jackson State killings. On the next slide, we can see in 1973, Nixon ends the war in Vietnam. He calls it peace with honor. And in 1971, he brings détente with the Soviet Union. Détente is a kind of a cooling off period between the United States and Russia. The relationship was always very tense, always fearful of nuclear war, and so Nixon passes the Strategic Arms Limitations Talk, or SALT as they're called, and so it freezes the size of the nuclear arsenal. And he also reaches détente with China in 1971. So Nixon, and you can see on the next slide, we see 4 pictures, and one is Nixon eating with Zhou Enlai. And then on the bottom, we can see that peace with honor, that's where we get out of Vietnam. And then on the left side, we see a Time magazine cover article where Nixon and the Russian chairman are talking with one another, and they're shaking hands, but they also have behind their back a bunch of bombs. And so they want to be nice to each other, but they're ready to throw bombs at each other. And then on the top middle, it says nuclear limits, and that's a flag of the United States and of the Soviet Union. And it just showed the limits of how many nuclear weapons we could have. Well, how many do you need to have? Do you need to have 1,000 ICBM or intercontinental ballistic missiles? Do you need to have those? 1,000? That's a lot. Nuclear submarines, how many do you need to have? Do you need to have 41 or 42? Because these nuclear weapons can destroy the world. And so the United States wanted to freeze the size of those arsenals. On this next page, this next slide, we see President Nixon shaking hands with Chairman Mao. It's a very famous photograph, a very famous trip that Nixon makes to China. And probably no other president could have done this because Nixon didn't like the Chinese. And no one liked the Chinese. And the Chinese didn't like the United States then. But with Nixon and Mao together, the opening up is a very good thing. And now today, the United States and China are have lots of good partnerships and lots of good trade. And so it's a good relationship now. So look at the election of 1972. We can see that in 1972, the entire map is red, with two exceptions. Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. has never voted Republican, ever. And then Massachusetts, which almost never votes Republican. But otherwise, Nixon wins the entire country. So this is Nixon from 68 to 72. And these are some of the things that he's doing. Now, the second part of his presidency, he's re-elected in November of 1972. And the second part of his presidency is not good. The first part of his presidency is pretty good, but the second term that he has in office, not good at all. And we're going to talk more about that, only about that, in the next lesson. So we'll see you guys then. Bye-bye.